Should you study grammar if you want to learn how to speak a language fluently? This is an interesting question because we're kind of in this moment where in the past it has always been the foundation of language learning classes to learn the grammar and do grammar drills, and it has always been a little more memorization focused. But now more and more, there are people coming forward and saying, I learned a language without studying the grammar, just by immersing myself in the language. So we kind of have different opinions about whether or not explicit grammar practice is good when you're learning a language. I can see both sides of this, and what I would say is that the basis of your language learning, if you want to be fluent in a language, should not necessarily be written grammar exercises. However, I think that grammar does have its place in language learning. What I mean by this is, if your goal is to speak fluently in conversation, but in order to get there, you're doing written exercises where you're filling in the blanks and adding the end of a word or something like that. These are two very different things. Doing these very structured written grammar exercises will not bring you to conversational fluency. So that's the first thing I would say, is that anytime, especially in language learning, anytime that you want to get better at something in particular, you need to try to imitate this as a way to get there. So if you want to be better at explaining yourself in meetings, specifically that is what you should be practicing to work towards. There's a kind of separation if you never practice speaking or listening, but you want to be better at conversations, and your way of getting there is doing these very traditional grammar textbook exercises. There's kind of a disconnect there. Instead of that, really the foundation for your language learning, and I say this because every student that I've had that's had a high level of English, they have been immersed in the language in some way, not necessarily only living in an English-speaking country, but watching movies, watching videos, reading books, and really consuming content in English. This, to me, is the foundation of learning a language, is living and immersing yourself in consuming content in the language, and then also practicing your own production of the language. However, I also think grammar has its place, but maybe you should practice grammar not in this traditional way, and try a different strategy. When I was working a couple of years ago at a language institute, I did a teacher training, and they told us something that I really agreed with, which is that you should, as a teacher, only teach grammar that your student will be able to use in conversation. So for example, if your student is very beginner and maybe can do some talking in the present tense about kind of their day-to-day life a little bit, but doesn't always, get the correct conjugation of the verbs or doesn't always have the vocabulary, it's not really that helpful to teach something like conditional sentences or a more complex grammar structure to this student, because the most important thing when you're learning to speak fluently is that you can also practice what you hear and use what you hear. So maybe if it's a fixed expression like I would like, and using I would like for ordering food, teaching maybe a reduced number of fixed expressions, even if it uses a complicated grammar structure, that can be super helpful. But not going into this deep exercise of, if this, then I would that, and really teaching complex or second conditional sentence, that's not really going to be so useful, because what will happen is that you spend the whole class explaining the structure to the student, and then they're never able to use it or connect it to their real life. So that's something that I really took with me. That is something I tried to do, even if the student potentially could do more in the written exercises, keeping it a little bit more basic when it comes to the explicit grammar instruction to something that they could actually use in real life, because if you don't use it, you lose it. So that's something that I kind of use as a guideline. Along the same lines as that, I also am a proponent for corrective grammar. For example, I have one student and he's more advanced, but I noticed that he would sometimes use the present and not the past when making a conditional sentence. Like, if I have $1 million, I would buy a house, for example. But considering his level, that he can speak really fluently about a lot of different things, and this was kind of a common error that he always has, I found it really important to explicitly correct this error and try to make him see the logic about why he should not use the present tense when it's not a real situation. And for me, that comes from finding a logic to the grammar. In English, for example, we use the present simple to talk about things that are real and true, about facts and habits and things that always happen or never happen. And the past tense, when we say, if I had $1 million, it's kind of like creating the separation from the present and past reality. And so really trying to explain that, sending the student songs that use conditional sentences, and then in the class when I have them speaking freely, really providing this correction over and over until it clicks, because there will be that moment where it clicks when you give enough correction, explanation, and different ways to understand something. And this brings me to another point, which is that I find that a lot of people, when they do learn explicit grammar structures, they struggle with understanding when to use them. It's really helpful as a teacher for the student to point out explicitly when are they going to need this structure. For example, a lot of people might not understand the importance of the past tense, but if at the beginning of every class I ask you, how was your weekend? You're going to need to use the past tense in that moment. Or if I'm talking to you about your day and the day's not finished yet, I might ask you, how has your day been so far? And you might tell me something like what you have already done in the day and what you haven't done yet in the day, which would be using the present perfect tense. A lot of people just don't really know how to apply tenses and grammar to their everyday life. For that reason, I also would say that maybe traditional grammar exercises do not always help when it comes to speaking fluidly, but at the same time, understanding grammar and the concepts behind it and the logic behind it, especially when it's appropriate at the level you're at, can really help you to correct your mistakes and also to understand something instead of just memorizing that it is the way it is. I think it's also important as a learner to understand that some things are so simple that they'll be introduced to you and you'll understand right away, and maybe need to practice a few times or review it a few times, but it will pretty much stick right when you learn it because it just makes a lot of sense to you. But that probably won't be most things. So it's completely fine if you see a video or see content that is maybe above your current level of understanding, and kind of taking what you are able to from it, and over time, more exposure to this topic will help you to eventually understand it completely. And I think having a positive attitude towards just taking whatever you can from the materials that you have in front of you is a really good strategy. For example, I am really beginner in German. I'm taking some beginner German classes. And the teacher pretty early on showed us how to form the past tense in German. And I don't really think at this point, because I really lack the fluidity in the present, I don't really think I could have a fluid conversation in the past either in German. And I don't expect to. However, what I did take from the structure is basically recognizing the way that German past tense verbs look. And that's super helpful. So now I can look at a text and understand if the person is talking in the past or the present. And the same thing with spoken German. A lot of the time people feel this need for a word for word understanding of something before they're able to respond or feel like they understand enough of it. But I think that even beyond word for word understanding, there are other things that you can take from any content that you see. You can learn, oh, okay, so good to know the word get can be used in more ways than I thought. Or, okay, good to know it seems like these past tense verbs kind of have a similar sound. I think sometimes people run into problems when their mentality is to understand, study, and memorize grammar until it's perfect so they can then use it in conversation. And they don't feel like they can before that happens. And I would say that that's very limiting, because understanding a lot of these complicated grammar concepts will come little by little and dose by dose. Some days you'll learn something really simple, and other days you might actually have that big click. So every little ounce of exposure that you can have is very helpful, and take what you can from every lesson that you learn. So my tips for learning grammar would be, first, the basis of your language learning, if you want to achieve fluidity, should be consuming content in that language, getting a lot of input, and trying to immerse yourself as much as possible, and also trying to produce and create as much as possible, practicing your speaking and writing to allow yourself the space to make mistakes. And when you do that, using corrective grammar to correct the mistakes at the level that you're at. At the same time, also try to associate grammar concepts with when you will use them in the real world. Thinking about going to relative to plans. What's a plan that you have? How can you use going to talk about this plan? Thinking about the past when you're catching up with someone about the weekend, etc. And the last thing is, don't discount content even if it's not really at your level. Try to take whatever you can from whatever you're watching. Be patient with yourself. If you don't get something 100%, what's something little that you can take from it that you didn't know yesterday? And if you do, and if you are able to take a little something from a video or something that you read, you're better off than you were yesterday. So that's what I would say about that.